So I hopped on Roll20 LFG and found a game, applied through an annoying questionnaire, and a whole screening process via Discord voice chat was accepted. Set out a time and date with the DM to do a character creation since it was homebrewed and tedious. Go through the whole character creation process for 3 hours with the Dungeon Master, and then we got to the player character token picture. He sent me a list of young British celebrities on IMDb, so I picked one off there, John Boyega. I cut the background out and sent him the image. Instantly I heard a groan. He then went on to explain how in his homebrew fantasy world, there were only white people in the city the game takes place in. He then said some bullshit about realism and tried to justify it. I accepted the wasted time and just dipped. I truly can't understand why you would make an entire homebrew world just to segregate people in it. Ah yes, Lan Dion, my favorite homebrew campaign setting. But okay, seriously, first of all, you're making them use celebrity lookalikes for their tokens? I can't really take a game like that seriously, especially one where the DM's making it super serious and like a strict homebrew. So what, the bard's gonna have his icon be Simon Pegg and I'm supposed to take this campaign seriously? Come on now. Greetings adventurers and welcome to the Luca Marketplace. When playing a tabletop game, it is important to remember that everyone's time is valuable. You all set aside several hours to play each session, and it may take months or even years to complete a campaign. If you're running into a situation where a Dungeon Master doesn't give each player a chance to feel included, or you have a player that wants to be the main character and sucks up all the game time, it will make you wonder why you even bothered showing up. There is a saying that scheduling issues is every campaign's big bad evil guy, but poor pacing and a lack of player agency are some of their strongest henchmen. So make sure to be honest about how your games are going, because you may find that when it comes time to plan the next session that many of your players aren't free anymore. Our next story goes by the name Main Character Forces DM to play several adventures at the same time while the other players have to twiddle their thumbs. Session 0 and 1. Here are the facts. A few years ago, I ran a Call of Cthulhu campaign. My fellow players took on the roles of a psychiatrist and a private detective. My optimal group size is 2 to 4 players, and at the request of my 2 players, I set out to find a third member for our group. I placed an ad on a German tabletop gaming site and soon received a reply from Mike, the main character of this story. Since we didn't know each other yet, we decided to meet for a coffee to check out the vibe. I liked Mike right away. He was open and enthusiastic and an experienced role player. Since I repeatedly had to deal with problem players in the past, I made it clear that I see TTRPGs as a team effort and that it is important to me and the other players that players and the Dungeon Master work together and everyone has fun. Mike agreed and in turn told a horror story from one of his past games. So everything was fine, right? We had a session 0 in which we discussed our expectations and no-goes. The only thing relevant to this story is that we reiterated that we were all in this together, respect each other's time, and play with each other instead of against each other. Everyone agreed. Mike rolled a fortune teller who, through deception and sleight of hand, pretended to have real magical abilities. It was clear that Mike had put a lot of effort into this character and was looking forward to sending her on an adventure. Context: Mike is male but plays as a female character. To avoid confusion, I will refer to him as he in this story. Here's where it gets crazy. At the beginning of the campaign, all player characters received a letter from an archaeologist who was considered an eccentric outsider in his field. Each player character was acquainted with him in one way or another. In his letter, he wrote of a major discovery that he, for the time being, only wanted to share with people he trusted. He invited the player characters to his current location, a small town in southern Germany, where he and the fourth associate, an old pastor, would be waiting for them. The player characters arrived in town by train, and the psychiatrist and detective got to know each other right away. This is where I may have messed up. The player characters knew about each other, but had no other connection to each other. In all my years as Dungeon Master, this has never been a problem, and obviously it wasn't for the psychiatrist and the detective either. But I had determined that if the characters were more familiar with each other in some way at the beginning, the following situation might have been avoided. While the other two were talking about the extremely mysterious letter from the archaeologist and discussing what their first step would be, Mike joined them briefly, asking something like, "Are you here because of the archaeologist's letter?" They both answered in the affirmative, whereupon Mike said, "Well, that's good to know. I have to go now," and he left. He said to me as the Dungeon Master he wanted to go to the church. The psychiatrist and the detective set off without Mike's character to check into the hotel where the archaeologist was supposed to be waiting for them, only to discover that he had not been in his room for 5 days. With clever role-playing and a good dice roll, the detective gained access to the room and discovered a torn-out page of a diary in a trash can. Here the player characters read that he had purchased a copy of an occult book, which is why they were hunting him and had already murdered his friend, the old pastor. More clues were suspected in the pastor's apartment. Meanwhile, Mike arrived at the church office where he met the new pastor. Mike, not knowing that he had the wrong guy in front of him, tried to find out the whereabouts of the archaeologist. When he finally learned that the old pastor was dead, he said goodbye and started his shopping tour. The first thing he asked me was whether there was a photographer in town. During my preparations in the campaign, I learned that there's actually a photographer in the city in question who had been active since the early 1920s, so I was happy to include him in the adventure. Mike asked the photographer about magnesium and potassium permanganate. I'm not a chemist and only have a slight knowledge of photography, so I asked Mike what he was planning to do. His answer was, "You'll see." Not cool, but I let it be. Next, he asked if there was an esoteric shop in town. I wasn't sure if there was such shops in Germany in the 20s, so I asked him again, "What exactly are you planning?" Mike again grinned broadly and replied, "You'll see." This time, I didn't let it go. Me: "Don't you think as the dungeon master I should know what you're planning?" Mike: "No." Me: "Why not?" Mike: "I have a surprise for you." Me: "I hate surprises." Short silence. Me: "Listen, I'm the dungeon master. I'm not playing against you, I'm playing with you. We're all on the same team, and if you tell me what you're planning ahead of time, I can do a better job of preparing, which in turn will give you a better chance of success. I can't possibly memorize the entire inventory of every single store, and I have no idea what the properties of every single chemical are. If I know what the end result is that you want, I can prepare something, so what do you say?" Mike: "Okay, I want to slip the pastor opium and then intimidate him with the light and smoke show to learn what happened to the old pastor." I let Mike do as he pleased. Fortunately, the other two player characters used Mike's shopping trip to talk to the young priests themselves and obtain the keys to his deceased colleague's apartment. Since I wanted to reunite the group, I constructed the scene so that Mike saw the other two player characters coming out of the church office and opening a door across the street. They invited him to search the apartment with them, but Mike declined. While the two were going through the old priest's belongings and discovered a clue about the catacombs running under the city, Mike prepared his light and smoke show. Long story short, Mike slipped some opium into the priest's wine, lit incense sticks, and blinded him with several rounds of flash powder while pretending to be the devil. The pastor was terrified and hid under his desk. Mike's extensive preparations and masterful intimidation check did not change the fact that the pastor knew absolutely nothing about the circumstances of his predecessor's death or the whereabouts of the archaeologist. Realizing that he couldn't get any information out of the priest, Mike broke one of the windows with the chair and jumped from the first floor, drawing a thick cloud of smoke behind him and accompanied by panicked screams of the pastor. Perhaps this is a good opportunity to mention that it was broad daylight and the church was located in the middle of the city center, in front of a large square where dozens of people were milling around at the time. The crowd screamed and immediately the whistle of the police patrol sounded, loudly ordering Mike to stop. When I saw the look on Mike's face, I suddenly realized what kind of player I had in front of me. Mike must have pulled off such stunts before, and the fact that he was suddenly dealing with the police was probably the first time he had been confronted with the consequences of his actions. At the time, there was a festival in town, and I decided that he had the chance to hide in a group of costumed people. His role was a success and he got away. Since this was Mike's first adventure with our group, I didn't want to let him rot in jail for the rest of the session, but I hoped that he would take this as a warning shot. It turned out that my expectations would be disappointed. You know, so far, I kind of get you're trying to go with the flow, feel out the party, but it seems like Mike has already turned down like 3 opportunities to hang out with the party. This man is being a lone wolf at best, and probably in worst case scenario, thinks that his time's the most important and he's the main character and everyone else is just a B-plot. So you definitely have to crack down on this guy. The psychiatrist and the detective had since found a city guide who told them that there was access to the catacombs under one of the local breweries. Most of the tunnels were not open to the public, but a small part was accessible for guided tours. A little unsure what to do next, Mike wandered through the streets and I decided that he saw the other 2 player characters waiting at a bus stop to get to the brewery. Mike turned away from them and walked on. At this point, the psychiatrist player let out an audible sigh. I asked, "Are you sure?" Mike thought about it for a moment and finally decided to approach them. He offered to drive them to the brewery since he was the only one in the group who had a car. For the rest of the adventure, the group worked together. They talked to the old demented brewmaster, gained access to the catacombs, wandered through the darkness, and finally overpowered a cultist who was waiting for them in an altar room. By the way, the catacombs are a real-life place, but there is not a hidden shrine to a hungry god there. At least I hope so. Here the player characters found not only the occult book, but also the archaeologist who was injured, dehydrated, but still alive and tied up in the corner, ready to give the player characters answers to their questions in the next session. After the session, we talked about the adventure as a group. We also talked to Mike, and the two players said that they had only accepted the offer of a ride for meta reasons, because they wanted the adventure to continue as a group. I also explained that it was difficult for me to have to lead two adventures at the same time. We told Mike, and we meant it, that we would like to continue playing with him, but that his character should work to gain the group's trust as he has previously constantly avoided them. Session 2. The detective player brought a friend for the second session. She played a journalist and received a letter similar to the others before the start. The in-game reason why they couldn't participate in the first adventure was that her train just did not arrive on time. The cliche of punctual Germans does not apply to public transport. The adventure more or less started when the last one left off. The player characters took the archaeologist to the hospital. He reported that he had been searching for a long time for a lost temple of an ancient god and had found clues to his location in the occult tomb of unspeakable cults. He asked the player characters to watch the book while he was in the hospital. The player characters were made aware of the book's absolute importance for the rest of the plot. Mike immediately tried to convince the group to let him watch the book. Since the group had absolutely no reason to trust Mike's character, they declined. Mike tried a persuasion roll on the psychiatrist, but I immediately forbade it, so Mike conceded for now. The group went to the hotel, where everyone had their own room prepaid by the archaeologist. The player characters went to bed, but Mike's character stayed up late. Long after midnight, he left his room and crept to the psychiatrist's door. He picked the lock with the lockpick, rummaged through her stuff, and took the book and disappeared again. I made Mike roll the dice with every damn step. When he picked the lock, when he crept through the room, and when he rummaged through the suitcase, and when he left the room again. Mike made every roll. He went in and out like a shadow. The psychiatrist's player sat there with an annoyed expression on her face the whole time. She started to ask why, but then stayed in character and held back the question. The journalist's player was visibly confused. Then, instead of going back to his room, he left the hotel and went off in the middle of the night to look for another one. He found a cheap motel, checked in, and hid the book behind a radiator. Only then did he go to bed. The next morning, the player characters minus Mike sat at a breakfast table, explaining the events so far to the journalist and planned their next move. Of course, they quickly realized that both Mike and the book had disappeared. Although the players knew what had happened, the player characters suspected that Mike had been kidnapped along with the book, just as the archaeologist had been. They began to discuss how they could free him. I wondered briefly how far the group would go to track down Mike and prepare to rescue him from the clutches of a dangerous cult. I was sure that at least one of the players would see this through to the bitter end. I, however, had had enough. The session had only lasted 20 minutes, and I was already forced to improvise a second bullshit adventure because Mike had planned another solo trip. There was no way I was going to let the player characters go on a mini adventure when their player actually knew it was going to be a wild goose chase. So I asked Mike, now in a decidedly sterner tone than in the last session, why are you doing this after all the conversations we've had before? He tried to play dumb at first, but I kept badgering him until he finally uttered the wonderful sentence, "That's what my character would do." Oh boy, he did it. He said the thing, guys. That means it's not his fault. I said, great, there's a super easy solution for that. Mike, what's that? Me, can't you just play a character who acts less like a selfish asshole and who is interested in working with the rest of the group? Mike, well, I guess so. Me, great, we don't have to change your character sheet for that, so let's go. Mike's character went to the hotel, where he arrived at the breakfast table just in time and told the characters a wild story of cultists who had entered the hotel at night and had stolen the book. He had chased them down, killed them, and brought the book back safely. I let him have it. The rest of the adventure went by with almost no further escapades on Mike's part, but of course he tried to make off with the book one more time, to which I simply responded with a brief no. At the end of the session, when everyone had left and I was home alone again, I thought long and hard about the last two adventures. At this point in my role-playing career, I had reached a point where my tolerance for problem players were very low. I had already had to deal with all sorts of that guyisms. I had a creep at the table who just didn't realize that the female characters were disgusted by him rather than charmed by his advances. I had several players who were up to 2 hours late without giving notice. I had players who, even after 3 years, still didn't have their own rulebook, and even after all this time, still had to ask how to make a simple attack roll. Apart from in real life violence, moments, I've seen just about every kind of nonsense a Dungeon Master can endure. As a result, I often planned and ran campaigns out of a twisted sense of duty, rather than because I really enjoyed it. Every time I picked up the pen to work at an NPC or draw a dungeon, I wanted to puke because the only thought in my head was what kind of crap that guy would pull this time, and I'd finally had enough. The next day, I discussed the situation with the other players. We all agreed that Mike's BS was going too far and there was no coming back. So I took my phone and sent Mike a voicemail explaining that he was no longer invited to the next session. The reason for this is his constant solo escapades in which he doesn't seem to give a shit whether the other players are having fun or not. Also, he doesn't seem to be able to get rid of that stupid player versus Dungeon Master mentality, and that took care of the problem. The journalists fit in wonderfully with the group, and we had a year-long campaign that took the player characters from Germany to Austria, from there to Cairo, to the city without a name, and back to Germany, from where they flew an airship through a portal to the other world and punched the big bad evil guy in the face with an umbrella. Dear Mike, which isn't really your name, should you read this, I think you're a great guy. We had coffee with you. I got really good vibes from you, and you definitely put a lot of heart into creating your characters. That's wonderful, but I hope that in the time that has passed since our game, you have learned that you are not the only player in an RPG session, and that the other people in game also want a moment in the spotlight and to enjoy their time at the table. Wherever you are now, I hope you found a group where you can have fun and bring just as much fun to your fellow players. Honestly, I didn't have to chime in here very much for the story because this is a veteran who handled it very well. One thing I like about this RPG horror story is it's only 2 sessions long because he knew to cut that guy out. In session 0, he has clear expectations. In session 1, the player seems not to meet them, tries to be a main character, avoids multiple times grouping with the party. So the other party members and the Dungeon Master come together and say, hey, if you want to be a player at this table, you actually have to be a part of the party that's playing at this table. Very controversial stuff, I know. Mike agrees, everyone's happy, it seems like it's been great, and then 20 minutes into the next session, it's very clear he's up to his stuff again, and he calls Mike out on it immediately. Mike tries to do the right thing because he's kind of forced to, and they play out the rest of the session, and he still sees hints here and there that Mike's still trying to do the same, nonsense that he doesn't want at the table. And by session 3, Mike's gone. This was handled very well, and from what he says, Mike isn't even that bad of a problem player. I'm so glad this is a story where it's not 20 sessions in, the guy's still doing the same things over and over again, and the story ends with, yeah, the campaign blew up, I kind of lost my cool. Eventually we played a new campaign without the guy, but I really wish I kicked him sooner. So good for you. Now, by contrast, I want to cover a story where the Dungeon Master doesn't value the player's time. And this one is called The DM That Refused to Prep Sessions and Would Just Make Things Up to Eat Session Time. There's a key recommendation to upcoming Dungeon Masters that I think a lot of people misinterpret. The suggestion to learn to improvise is a great one because all Dungeon Masters will know your party will eventually surprise you and venture into a direction you did not expect. This is advice that any Dungeon Master should follow, or they're forced to relegate to the railroad when the party takes the alternate route. But some people think you should only improvise and make bare bones preparation. And maybe there are some really good Dungeon Masters out there that have the ability to do that, but for most people, prep is absolutely key for making a good game, and here's why. I joined a homebrew game about an empire that was currently going through political turmoil and losing foreign wars, greatly weakening it. It sounded very similar to my own game, so I joined up. I decided to play an Inquisitor type character trying to re-strengthen the empire by any means necessary. If the other players happened to want to rebel, then my character could be flexible enough to think a new revolution was necessary. We start the session with 2 other party members, Ranger and Bard, hanging around a tavern as I come in to investigate a town. Bartender tells us bandits have been raiding the town and the local magistrate is looking for volunteers. Cool, the other player members hear this and low on coin decide to join up with me. After about an hour of talking and introductions, we decide to head our way to the magistrate, when suddenly a nearby man grabs my character's hand and tells me to play card games with them. My character refuses, he's here on business. The man is insistent, we refuse thrice, and he still won't relent, causing my character to glare at him and ask if he's interfering with Inquisitor business. The Dungeon Master asks me for an intimidation roll, and after a success finally leaves us alone. We attempt to leave the bar only to be stopped by the waitress. The waitress starts talking about how cool and powerful the party looks, and then starts blogging about her own life out of nowhere. We talk and try to leave leave only for her to now offer services for gold. We refuse, she's insistent, and we again have to refuse several times before she finally backs off. But before we can, the ranger has to make a con save for the one ale he drank 30 minutes ago, and when he fails goes unconscious as we all have to spend the next 10 minutes trying to wake him. Finally, outside the tavern, we come across a beggar asking for money. We refuse considering everyone is low on gold and try to move on, only for the beggar to start clinging on the ranger's leg. Ranger has to roll athletics, and when he fails, he tumbles to the ground while the beggar begs for money, and I have to draw my sword to get him to back off. As we make our way to the magistrate, a random man on a horse suddenly attacks us. Ranger shoots him and knocks him off his horse. Bard heals him up, and we demand answers for why he attacked us. The man is very nonchalant in his attitude, refusing to answer even under the threat of sword. After asking him multiple times and threatening, he finally answers that he's part of some noble house and thought we were from a rival house. My character is incensed, asking why he would think total random strangers he saw were from a rival house, and the man just shrugs, going on and on about how he hates the rival house. I almost execute the man right there, only for us to be attacked again by another horseman. The bard casts dissonant whispers on the horse, and we tell the dungeon master flatly we just run away so we don't have to deal with this. We finally make it to the magistrate, only for the guard in front to ask who each of us are, and we need to give our background stories that we have already said back in the tavern. As the clock finally hits the 4th hour of session time, the dungeon master starts clapping his hands and goes, "Perfect, the session went exactly 3 hours as I wanted. See you next week, folks." And if it wasn't obvious now, the dungeon master was throwing every single thing he could think of to prevent us from actually meeting the magistrate. He was throwing every single thing to eat up session time as much as possible. Pretty annoying, but maybe he didn't have enough time? The next week is exactly the same. The magistrate greets us and tells us that we have to see a lieutenant at the other side of town for details on the bandits. We just spent 3 hours getting to this guy, and he tells us that we have to see someone else. The bard asks why in the world he wouldn't have the information on the bandits, and the magistrate shrugs and says it's not his position to know military affairs. I would have lost my cool when the bard asked that question because yeah, your first session was such a waste of time. He threw literally a bunch of dialogue at you, like you got forced into a bunch of NPC cutscenes where people just complained about random stuff, and for some reason once you got there he still has to buy time because he didn't prepare between session 1 and 2, and he's like yeah, go even farther to talk to the lieutenant. These kind of talk to person A to talk to person B to end up in location C are some of my least favorite quests when it comes to MMOs, so I have no idea why he thinks it would translate well into Dungeons and Dragons. Anyways, back to the story. So off we go to meet this lieutenant, only for a freaking storm to suddenly appear. The storm is so strong, the rains are so heavy, the winds are so powerful that midway through the town we are forced to rest in a nearby house. In the house is a granny. We offer her 1 gold piece from each of us after explaining our situation. The granny offers us food. We tell her no thanks since we're already in her home and have rations. When we try to sleep, the granny then requests each of us to start fixing things in her house. Leaky roof, broken cupboard, a rat hiding in a corner, a dirty cooking pan, all of which require rolls and more time. An hour is spent in the granny's house before we finally rest and move on. We meet the lieutenant, who again asks for our backstories and why we want to help clear the bandits. Finally, he tells us there are about 8 of them in a nearby forest. We go into the forest only to be stopped by fallen trees blocking our ways. All of us have to roll athletics about 5 times to clear the trees, and the dungeon master goes to painstaking descriptions of how our characters' backs hurt and feel tired and hands are itchy if we roll anything below 10. The dungeon master tells us it's been half a day and we need to camp and long rest again. We decide to forage for food, and then the dungeon master starts listing off every single animal and vegetables he can think of. Bard tells him he just wants to find vegetables that aren't poisonous, and then he starts listing off the same things again for some reason. Ranger says he's going to hunt for animals, and again the dungeon master starts listing off every possible animal he can think of in the woods. Ranger has to tell him that he will hunt literally anything, and after a survival check runs across a rabbit. Ranger rolls to shoot it with an 18 and misses. Dungeon master tells him the bushes, shrubs, and forests somehow made Ranger miss with an 18. 18, mind you guys, is plate armor status. Ranger has to continue chasing the rabbit, and the dungeon master just drags the session for another 10 minutes. Several of the Ranger shots still missing until he finally lands a 23, which was apparently the magic number he needed to kill this rabbit. Trying to forage food and cook takes us an entire hour of session time. We finally get to do the long rest, we resume our journey, and and the Dungeon Master says we find the bandit encampment. He starts clapping his hands and goes, "Wow guys, another perfect 4-hour session ending right on time. This is going really well if I don't say so myself. Okay, next week I'll get the bandit stats and find a map somewhere online for the battle." Yeah, I was done and quit the game. I perfectly understand that a TTRPG isn't just finding a quest and doing a combat session, but when it took 8 hours of forced interactions to finally just arrive at the bandits we were supposed to fight, when things are being dragged out for no sake of enriching a world but to eat up time, and random weather events and falling trees impede the path just to extend the session time, the game loses authenticity. Please people, a good game has both great preparation and improvisation. Honestly, the author of this story has every right to quit after 2 sessions, kind of like how the DM had the right to kick the other guy after 2 sessions. This sounds miserable to sit through. Also, I think he's being a little too generous by saying that the guy was just improvising, since he really didn't listen to your guys' feedback, and no matter what you did, he found another way to roadblock you guys. I don't really think it's fair to call it improv. And after 2 sessions, him just admitting to you guys flat out that he doesn't even have the bandit stats or a battle map yet is ridiculous. This man ran a campaign, invited a bunch of people, decided to look up nothing ahead of time, and for some reason in the first 2 weeks, he couldn't be bothered to just wing it. I mean, the only combat encounter he allowed you guys to have was the rabbit. He probably had like a number in his head about how many rounds it should take, and when the ranger rolled super high at the beginning and 1 arrow should have killed the rabbit, he's like, I thought 5 rounds in my head, we're gonna make it 5 rounds long. So your player agency did not exist. Even your combat agency didn't exist. It is a pretty big commitment to be a dungeon master, and early on it is important to do a lot of prep time just so you have several options you can throw your party's way. And yeah, as a veteran, it's totally true that you've ran so many sessions, you can borrow from an old campaign, throw an encounter in there or a fun NPC from a previous campaign. A good improv from the dungeon master's side almost looks like you planned it all along, and sometimes you might even get a player that compliments how well prepared that session was when in fact you were just kind of winging it for the last 2 or 3 hours. The only thing this dungeon master seemed to have in his head is he had a point A, point B, point C. The C being bandits, and for some reason he decided that A and B had to take 4 hours each. Please value players' time more than that. If you're already going to be committing 4 hours for a couple weeks, and then by the 3rd session you realize that it's a waste of your time, that really sucks. You're never going to get like those 12 hours back, and finding a group can always be hard, but just don't be afraid to cut it early, because if you don't quit after session 2 or kick that problem player out after session 2, you're going to be hundreds of hours into the campaign, and you're still going to end up on RPG Horror Stories probably, but this time you're going to have people in the comments questioning why it took you guys so long to just leave. I want to hear your guys' feedback, so make sure to comment if you liked having a bunch of stories with like a similar theme put in the same video, and I hope to see you guys in the next video. Farewell for now.